In the news for the past several weeks has been the outrage at the new zero-tolerance policy along the southern United States border. The policy has been the driving force behind families being separated and the sometimes indefinite detainment of children. Some Americans have likened the policy in its various forms to the World War II-era practice of putting Japanese Americans into internment camps. One such American is actor George Takei, who himself was imprisoned in a U.S. internment camp. Author and historian Richard Cahan explored the topic of U.S. internment camps in his book, Un-American: The Incarceration of Japanese Americans During World War II. He says anytime internment camps are being treated as precedent, that should be a red flag.
If this is precedent, if this is the road we want to go down, and the road really helped destroy tens of thousands of families, and it was deemed illegal, and it was certainly not moral. I guess you could say it happened in the past, but as precedent, no, it's not.
Japanese internment is one of the topics America looks back on with shame. But do we really understand the history of the camps? They're brushed over in schools, and you almost never see them covered in hit movies. But they're an important piece of our country's history to look back on and learn from, now more than ever.
What happened during World War II, the incarceration of 110,000 Japanese Americans, was an un-American act. It was different than what our country stands for. And we wrote the book because we know that we're at a time now that is not dissimilar from the early days of World War II. Security is first on our mind, and we look around the country and we fear the idea that our country might be attacked or sabotaged.
And Cahan says he and his co-author Michael Williams were inspired by that tendency the country has had to brush over this dark cloud in our history books to show people without bias or exaggeration exactly what this injustice looked like.
A friend of mine, after the book came out, took me aside. He's 35, 40 years old, and he said, "I'm sorry to tell you this, but I've never even heard this story before." So it does slip through our knowledge base, and that's one of the reasons why this book, I think, is so important. There's been great books of both nonfiction and fiction written about the incarceration, but this gives people a visual look. Photographs are evidence, and so we're not just making this up. You can see these pictures. You can see the conditions of the camp, and being a photo book, it's the first time that a comprehensive photo book like this has ever been put together, and I think it's really important.
So let's jump into the facts of Japanese incarceration. According to Cahan, one thing people are always shocked to hear for the first time is exactly how many people the U.S. government put into these camps.
110,000 people were forcibly removed from their homes. In America at the time, there were about 125,000 Japanese Americans living in America. So basically 9 out of 10 people were picked up. And of that 110,000, 70,000 of them were born in the United States.
And with all those people living in close quarters, comfort and privacy were not paramount considerations.
Families were put into small barrack-like rooms, and the rooms were oftentimes shared intergenerationally, so we literally have people who are just married living with their grandparents. Most of the camps were in the middle of deserts. The conditions were harsh. They weren't going to give them prime real estate. The wind blew through the very light barrack-like structures. There was one light bulb per room. There was a small stove per room. Food was served in mess hall-like settings. At first, there was no accommodation to the Japanese diet, and so many people were having problems that the menus did switch, so that there were kind of American foods and there were more traditional Japanese foods. Each barrack had a toilet facilities and showers. The toilets oftentimes were not separated. There was no privacy in the toilets. People were very traumatized by this.
Cahan says most people hear these details, shudder at the thought of it, and begin to ask, how could this have happened right here in America?
It came 11 weeks after Pearl Harbor, so not very long afterwards. And Franklin Delano Roosevelt, the president, decided that he would give the Army the final decision of what happens to Japanese Americans. And on the surface, it makes a little bit of sense because the Army is in charge of security in the country. But it's important to realize that the Army didn't care about the civil liberties or the rights of these people. They just simply cared about the security of this country. So it's very important that decisions like this don't get taken over by the military.
And giving the military the power to suppress rights in the name of security is one of the things Kahan says he hopes America can avoid repeating.
And of course, one of the concerns that I think many people have is that this new cabinet that's being announced, there's so many generals in the cabinet, and there's certainly nothing wrong with the military, and there's nothing wrong with generals, but the military thinks about security issues and doesn't consider all facets, and I think we've got to realize that, and that's one of the lessons that I learned from doing this story.
Kahan says once the decision was made by the military and the president to open the camps, there wasn't a whole lot of resistance, which leads us to one of the major ethical dilemmas of this history. Should we always blindly follow the laws of the land?
The Japanese Americans that went did it because they felt that this was their contribution to the war effort, and they felt that it was proper to follow higher-ups, the government. And so they went very, I won't say willingly, but I would say that they went in an obedient manner. And I think since the war, there's been great discussion in the Japanese community of whether they should have put up more of a fight. And of course, there is no answer. You know, it's easy to sit here 75 years later and come up with an answer. But if you recall how America changed within the couple of days before we started the Iraq war, you realize that fear and hysteria sweeps through and makes decisions difficult.
As the war was ending in 1945, the constitutionality of these internment camps was being considered by the Supreme Court.
Right when the Supreme Court was going to decide, everyone knew that they were going to decide that this was illegal. Franklin Roosevelt proclaimed that the camps should be opened and people could return.
Once the camps were closed, the Japanese Americans who had been forced to spend years of their lives living as prisoners were forced to begin again elsewhere.
Many returned to California. Many didn't want to go back to California because of the bad memories and because they had lost their homes and their farms and their property. So they started to spread out and settle all over America. Chicago was a big destination. People went all the way to New York. And interestingly, they were told that they could resettle, but they were encouraged greatly to separate, that the idea of coming together as small communities was frowned upon.
Ultimately, Kahan says he hopes this book can honor everyone who was forced into the camps.
One thing we wanted to show was just how American these people were, not only by their birthright, but the way they looked. You know, their check shirts and their boots and their leather belts. These were people just like you and I. And the book starts out with a quote by Lawson Inada, who was a camp survivor, and he was the former poet laureate of Oregon. And he wrote, "Only what we could carry." Only what we could carry was the rule that Japanese Americans were given when they were told what they could bring with them. So it shows you how little it was. And he wrote, "Only what we could carry was the rule, so we carried strength, dignity, and soul."
You can buy Richard Kahan's book, Un-American, The Incarceration of Japanese Americans During World War II, now online. For more information about all of our guests, visit our site at viewpointsonline.net. You can find archives of past programs there and on iTunes and Stitcher. I'm Gary Price.